My mother-in-law announced my husband's affair at our anniversary dinner, her smile triumphant. Until I revealed I'd secretly become the new owner of their failing family business. The silence that fell over the table when I slid the company ownership papers across to her was worth every penny of the acquisition. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special. For you! I sat motionless at the head of the mahogany dining table, crystal wineglass suspended halfway to my lips, as Eleanor, my mother-in-law of 7 years, finished her toast with the cruelest smile I'd ever witnessed. And while we're celebrating, anniversaries, she said, her voice carrying across the elegant dining room of her Westlake estate. Perhaps we should acknowledge Robert's other relationship that's apparently flourished this past year, the one with his assistant, Veronica. The imported Cabernet in my glass barely trembled despite the earthquake happening inside me. Across the table, my husband Robert's face drained of color, his eyes darting between his mother and me with the panic of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse. Before we continue, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for being part of this incredible journey. If you're enjoying these stories of unexpected twists and empowerment, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps us build this amazing community. Let's dive in. I maintained my composure, calmly setting down my wine glass. Is that so? I asked, my voice steadier than I had any right to expect. Eleanor's triumphant expression told me everything. She had waited for this moment, our 7th anniversary celebration, in front of Robert's father William, his 2 brothers Michael and Thomas who worked in the family business, and their perfectly polished wives. The perfect audience for my public humiliation. Diane, dear, Eleanor continued, false sympathy dripping from her voice. We've all known for months. I thought it was time someone was honest with you, especially given how uninvolved you've been in our family matters. What Eleanor couldn't know was that my uninvolvement had been a calculated decision. While she believed I was nothing more than a corporate attorney who had married into their manufacturing dynasty, the truth was far more complex. 7 years ago, when I met Robert at a charity gala, I was already a successful investor with a knack for identifying undervalued companies. I'd built my fortune quietly, operating through a network of investment firms and holding companies. When I fell in love with Robert, I decided to keep my wealth and business acumen private. I wanted to be loved for myself, not my portfolio. Perhaps we should change the subject, Robert's father William suggested weakly, his eyes not meeting mine. His hands fidgeted with his napkin, telltale signs of the anxiety that had been evident in his recent board meetings he didn't know I had recordings of. Why? Eleanor pressed, swirling her wine. Diane has always been an outsider to this family. Maybe if she'd shown more interest in Blackwell manufacturing instead of her little legal cases, Robert wouldn't have had to look elsewhere. I felt a calm settling over me, the same clarity I experienced before making a major acquisition. For years, I'd endured Eleanor's subtle digs about my career, my choice to keep my maiden name, my decision not to have children immediately. I'd weathered it all because I loved Robert, and because I believed his promises that he would eventually establish boundaries with his controlling mother. But as I looked at Robert, still silent, still allowing his mother to humiliate me, I realized he had never intended to choose me over his family, just as he'd never intended to remain faithful. Eleanor, Robert finally spoke, his voice strained. This isn't the time or place. When is the time, Robert? I asked quietly, all eyes turning to me. When were you planning to tell me about Veronica? Before or after your mother did? He had no answer. Thomas and Michael exchanged uncomfortable glances, while their wives, Claire and Jessica, suddenly found their dessert plates fascinating. Only Eleanor appeared to be enjoying the spectacle. This is exactly why I've always said she wasn't right. For you, Eleanor continued, addressing Robert as if I weren't present. No understanding of family legacy or loyalty. What none of them realized was that 3 months ago, when rumors of Robert's affair first reached me through a sympathetic colleague, I hadn't just hired a private investigator to confirm my suspicions. I'd also begun quietly investigating Blackwell, manufacturing the family legacy that Eleanor wielded as a weapon against anyone she deemed unworthy. What I discovered was a company in serious financial trouble, over-leveraged and mismanaged by William and his sons. The innovative metal fabrication business that Robert's grandfather had built had been slowly suffocating under their outdated approaches and excessive personal spending. The company had been forced to take out high-interest loans just to make payroll, all while the family continued to live in luxury. Meanwhile, Eleanor had been blocking any attempts at modernization, insisting that her late father-in-law's methods were sacred. Her sons, all installed in executive positions they hadn't earned, backed her decisions without question. The company was now desperately in need of a capital infusion and competent management. "You know, Eleanor," I said, reaching for my water glass, "it's interesting you should mention legacy and loyalty." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting me to make an emotional plea about my marriage. "Blackwell Manufacturing has quite a legacy," I continued conversationally. Founded in 1965, pioneered the double-reinforced titanium fabrication process that revolutionized aerospace components in the 80s. Your father-in-law was quite the innovator. "I'm glad you've finally taken an interest," Eleanor replied dryly, "but I fail to see how that's relevant now." "It's relevant because innovation requires investment and adaptation," I said. Two things that have been notably absent from Blackwell's strategy for the past decade. Robert's father, William, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Michael and Thomas exchanged nervous glances. "What exactly are you implying?" Eleanor demanded, her celebratory mood darkening. "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Blackwell Manufacturing is currently operating at 40% capacity. Your primary contracts with Aerodyne and Precision Systems weren't renewed last quarter. You've taken out 3 high-interest loans in the past year just to maintain operations." The room fell silent. Robert stared at me in confusion. "How could you possibly know any of this?" William finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because 3 months ago, Blackwell's board approved the sale of a controlling interest to Artemis Holdings," I replied calmly. "They were quite eager for the capital infusion, especially after your bank refused to extend your credit line further." "Artemis Holdings?" Robert repeated, recognition dawning in his eyes. 7 years ago, when we'd first met, I'd mentioned my first investment firm, named after the Greek goddess of the hunt. I'd sold it years ago, but kept the name for my private holding company. "You're right about one thing, Eleanor," I said, reaching for my handbag. "I should have been more involved in Blackwell Manufacturing." I removed a leather portfolio and placed it on the table, sliding it toward my mother-in-law. "What's this?" she asked, irritation crossing her features at my failure to crumble under her attack. "The ownership papers for Blackwell Manufacturing," I replied calmly. "I acquired the controlling interest 3 months ago." The silence that descended upon the dining room was absolute. Robert's glass slipped from his fingers, splashing red wine across the white tablecloth, a crimson stain spreading like the truth I'd just unleashed. Eleanor's manicured fingers trembled as she opened the portfolio. Her eyes darted across the legal documents, widening with each paragraph she read. The family crest of Blackwell Manufacturing, once embossed proudly on everything from company letterhead to Eleanor's personalized stationery, was now accompanied by the sleek arrow logo of Artemis Holdings. "This is impossible," she whispered, looking to William for contradiction. "Tell me this is some kind of sick joke." William's silence was confirmation enough. He had known about the sale. He'd signed the papers himself as chairman of the board, but clearly hadn't known that his daughter-in-law was behind the acquisition. Dad? Thomas prompted, reaching for the portfolio. What's going on? The company was drowning, William finally admitted, his voice hollow. The bank was threatening to call in our loans. The board voted unanimously to accept the buyout offer from Artemis Holdings. It was the only way to keep Blackwell operational. Without consulting the family. Eleanor's voice rose sharply. Without consulting me? You're not on the board, Mother, Robert said quietly, finding his voice at last. His eyes remained fixed on me, a mixture of confusion and something else. Perhaps a dawning realization of just how little he truly knew about the woman he'd married. I've been managing this company alongside William for 30 years. Eleanor. Snapped. Influencing, I corrected calmly. Not managing, there's a difference. Eleanor's gaze snapped to me, her eyes narrowing. You orchestrated this. All of it. I took a sip of water, considering my response. The truth was more nuanced than she imagined. I hadn't set out to acquire Blackwell Manufacturing. I wasn't that calculating. But when the rumors about Robert and Veronica began, I'd started paying closer attention to his family's business affairs. What I discovered had been genuinely concerning from an investor's perspective. I made a sound business decision, I replied. Blackwell has excellent fundamentals, a strong patent portfolio, and a skilled workforce. What it lacked was modern management and sufficient capital. So you just bought it? Robert asked, incredulity in his voice. Just like that? How could you possibly afford to purchase a controlling interest in a manufacturing company? And there it was, the question that revealed how little my husband knew me, despite 7 years of marriage. He'd never bothered to look beyond the carefully constructed image I presented. The dedicated attorney with a comfortable but not exceptional income, the supportive wife who admired his family's business legacy. I had resources, I said simply. My legal career was just one aspect of my professional life. Michael, always the most analytical of the brothers, studied my face with new interest. You're DGC Investments, aren't you? The venture capital group that's been acquiring distressed manufacturing firms across the Midwest. I smiled slightly. Michael had always been sharper than his brothers. DGC is one of my investment vehicles, yes. What does DGC stand for? Thomas asked, still trying to process the revelation. Diane Grace Chen, I replied. My maiden name. Robert's face flushed. During our courtship, he'd insisted on calling me Diane Blackwell, despite my preference to maintain my professional identity. It had been our first real argument, one that foreshadowed many of the challenges in our marriage. All this time, he said slowly, you've been what exactly? Some secret millionaire? Billionaire, actually, I corrected, the word dropping into the silence like a stone. Though that's a recent development. The pandemic created unique opportunities in certain manufacturing sectors. Eleanor's face had gone from red to white. I don't believe this. You've been lying to this family for 7 years. I've been private. About my finances, I countered. There's a difference. Just as there's a difference between discretion and deceit. I looked pointedly at Robert, who had the grace to flinch. William cleared his throat, years of business negotiations kicking in despite the personal nature of the revelation. What are your intentions with Blackwell Manufacturing? It was a fair question, the only one that mattered now. To save it, I said simply. Blackwell has tremendous potential, but it needs significant restructuring. The aerospace division is still viable, but the consumer products line has been losing money for years. The company has been supporting 3 separate corporate retreats and 7 executive salaries while operating at less than half capacity. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. His executive position overseeing the consumer products division had been largely ceremonial. Everyone at the table knew it. And who exactly will be making these decisions? Eleanor demanded, attempting to regain her footing. You? A lawyer with no experience in manufacturing? I smiled thinly. I have an MBA from Wharton and have successfully restructured 12 manufacturing firms in the past 5 years. But no, not just me. I've assembled a management team of industry veterans who will begin transitioning in next week. Next week? Michael repeated, alarm evident in his voice. That's too soon. The company lost $3.4 million last quarter, I countered. Every day of delay costs jobs. 200 families depend on Blackwell for their livelihoods. That silenced them. For all their talk of legacy and loyalty, the Blackwell family had become increasingly detached from the reality of the company's workforce. The extravagant anniversary dinner we were currently sitting through had cost more than what many Blackwell employees earned in a year. So what happens now? Claire, Michael's wife, asked quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken since Eleanor's initial revelation about the affair. I appreciated her practical question. Now, we finish our dinner. Tomorrow, I meet with the executive team to outline the transition plan. Some difficult decisions will need to be made about leadership and direction. The unspoken implication hung in the air. The family members who had treated their executive positions as birthright rather than responsibility would soon face evaluation based on merit alone. Robert finally found his voice again. And us? What about our marriage? The question drew all eyes back to me. Eleanor's triumphant revelation about Robert's infidelity now seemed like a lifetime ago, though barely 20 minutes had passed. That, I said evenly, is a separate discussion. One we'll have privately. Robert nodded slowly, the reality of his situation sinking in. The wife he had betrayed was now his boss, or more accurately, his boss's boss. You can't just take over our family business, Eleanor said, her voice rising again. There must be legal recourse. William, call Frederick. Frederick Nelson had been the family's attorney for decades. Frederick approved the sale. William replied wearily, along with the rest of the board. Then we'll find someone else, Eleanor insisted. This is theft. It's capitalism, I corrected. The same system the Blackwell family has profited from for 3 generations. The board had a fiduciary duty to accept the best offer to save the company. Mine was the only offer on the table. I rose from my seat, placing my napkin beside my barely touched anniversary cake. I think I'll pass on coffee. It's been a long evening, and tomorrow promises to be an even longer day. Robert half rose from his chair. Diane, please, not now, Robert, I said quietly. We both have a lot to think about. As I gathered my things, Eleanor made one last attempt to reassert control. This dinner isn't over. Actually, it is, I replied. For me, at least. But please, enjoy the rest of your evening. The anniversary cake is excellent. I selected it myself. I walked toward the door, feeling the weight of 7 pairs of eyes on my back. Just before exiting, I turned back to the stunned family. Oh, and Eleanor? The company jet you used last month for your shopping trip to Paris? It's been sold. Artemis Holdings has a strict policy against using company assets for personal travel. You'll find the new company policies in your email tomorrow morning. With that parting shot, I stepped into the cool evening air, closing the door on 7 years of pretense and the beginning of a new chapter, one where the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. In my car, alone at last, I allowed myself a moment to process everything that had transpired. The discovery of Robert's affair had been painful, but Eleanor's calculated cruelty in revealing it had clarified something important. I had spent years trying to earn acceptance from people who had never valued me for myself. My phone buzzed, with an incoming text from Alexis, my chief operating officer and the person who would be leading tomorrow's transition meetings at Blackwell. Everything ready for tomorrow? Her message read. I typed a simple reply. Yes, the family has been informed. Then I started my car and drove away from the Blackwell estate, leaving behind the role of the dutiful daughter-in-law and embracing fully who I had always been, a woman in complete control of her destiny. I arrived at Blackwell Manufacturing headquarters at precisely 7:30 the next morning. The imposing brick building with its faded 1970s-era signage stood as a testament to the company's glory days and its failure to evolve. I'd avoided visiting during my marriage to Robert, honoring the separation between personal and professional that he and his family had insisted upon. The irony wasn't lost on me, Alexis Chen, no relation, but a coincidence that had amused us both when we first met at business school, was waiting in the parking lot. At 45, 5 years my senior, she had spent 2 decades turning around, struggling manufacturing companies before joining my team 3 years ago. "Rough night?" she asked, handing me a coffee as I stepped out of my car. "Illuminating," I replied, accepting the cup gratefully. "How many are here for the 8 o'clock meeting?" "All 7 board members, including William. Also, the brothers arrived about 10 minutes ago." I raised an eyebrow. "All 3? "Robert included," she confirmed with a slight smile. "He's been pacing the conference room since he arrived?" I nodded, unsurprised. Robert had always been an early riser, especially when anxious. What did surprise me was his decision to attend at all. His official position at Blackwell had always been largely ceremonial, Vice President of Business Development, a role that mainly involved taking clients to golf outings and expensive dinners. "And Eleanor?" I asked, knowing she wasn't on the board but suspecting she wouldn't stay away. Attempted to enter the executive floor but was redirected to reception. Security has been implementing the new access protocols since 5 a.m. Alexis's efficiency was one of her most valuable qualities. She's currently waiting in the lobby, insisting she has always had access to all areas of this building. "Not anymore," I murmured, finishing my coffee. "Let's not keep everyone waiting." The lobby of Blackwell Manufacturing told the story of the company's decline better than any financial statement could. Once gleaming brass fixtures had dulled with age and inadequate maintenance. The reception desk, an enormous custom piece of walnut that had probably been impressive in 1980, now looked outdated and imposing. Behind it sat a security guard I didn't recognize, wearing the uniform of the professional security firm we'd contracted. Eleanor, dressed impeccably as always in a designer suit that cost more than most Blackwell employees made in a month, was arguing with the guard when we entered. "Mrs. Blackwell," I greeted her calmly. "This is a surprise." "Hardly," she snapped. "This is my family's company. I have every right to be here." "Actually," I corrected gently, "it's now a privately held corporation owned by Artemis Holdings, and only authorized personnel have access to secure areas." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "I've been coming to this building for 30 years. Every employee here knows who I am." "Which is precisely why we've implemented new security protocols," I replied. "To ensure that access is based on current operational requirements rather than historical precedent." Before she could respond, I turned to the security guard. "Mr. Reyes, please ensure Mrs. Blackwell is comfortable in the visitors area. If she wishes to meet with anyone from the executive team, she can schedule an appointment through the proper channels." The guard nodded professionally. Eleanor's face flushed with anger as she realized the depth of her new reality. For decades, she had treated Blackwell Manufacturing as her personal domain, despite having no official role. That era had ended. "This is outrageous," she began, but I was already walking toward the executive elevator, Alexis beside me. "She'll be a problem," Alexis noted quietly as the elevator doors closed behind us. "She's always been a problem," I replied. "But now she's a categorized and contained problem, which makes her manageable." The board meeting was scheduled for the 8th floor conference room, a space I'd seen only in photos until now. Like the lobby, it reflected the company's dated approach: heavy furniture, dark wood paneling, and a conspicuous absence of modern technology. The wall of windows overlooking the factory floor was its only redeeming feature. All eyes turned to us as we entered. William sat at the head of the table, a position he would soon vacate, with Robert, Michael, and Thomas arranged to his right. The other board members, two longtime family friends and the company's aging CFO, sat to his left. Alexis and I took the two empty seats at the opposite end of the table. "Gentlemen," I greeted them. "Thank you for accommodating this early meeting." William cleared his throat. "I believe there's been some confusion regarding the chain of command following Artemis Holdings' investment." "There's no confusion," I replied calmly. "The terms were quite clear in the acquisition agreement you signed 3 months ago. Artemis has acquired 67% of Blackwell Manufacturing, with full operational control effective immediately." The CFO, Harold Jenkins, shifted uncomfortably. "Ms. Chen, while the financial arrangement is indeed as you describe, there was an understanding that the management structure would remain intact." I smiled slightly. "There was an understanding that competent management would be retained. That evaluation begins today." Robert, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. "Diane, is this really necessary? We both know what this is really about." "Do we?" I asked, meeting his gaze directly. "Please, enlighten everyone." He faltered, unwilling to mention his affair in front of the board. "Our personal situation shouldn't affect the company." "I couldn't agree more," I replied. "Which is why your performance as VP of Business Development will be evaluated on the exact same metrics as every other executive. Results." Alexis opened her laptop and connected it to the projection system that our team had installed the previous evening. "Gentlemen," she began, "over the next 2 hours we'll be reviewing Blackwell Manufacturing's current position, our restructuring strategy, and the leadership changes necessary to return the company to profitability." The screen filled with a stark graph showing Blackwell's declining revenue over the past 5 years, juxtaposed against increasing executive compensation. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "As you can see," Alexis continued, "while the company's revenue has decreased by 37% since 2018, executive compensation has increased by 22% during the same period. This is unusual." "We've had to retain top talent," William offered weakly. "Indeed," I agreed, "which raises the question of how we're defining top talent." I turned to Thomas, who managed the Consumer Products division. "Thomas, your division has lost money for 12 consecutive quarters. Can you explain your strategy for reversing this trend?" Thomas blinked, clearly unprepared for direct questioning. "We've been focusing on brand development and positioning for future growth." "Future growth," I repeated. "And what specific metrics are you using to measure progress toward this future growth?" He glanced at his father, seeking rescue. "We've maintained our market presence despite difficult conditions." "Market presence," I noted, making it clear I recognized the empty corporate speak for what it was. "Your division employs 63 people and consumed $4.2 million in operating capital last year to generate $2.8 million in revenue. That's not maintaining market presence. That's systematic value destruction." The room fell silent. Thomas had never been subjected to this kind of performance assessment before. None of them had. "Michael," I continued, turning to the middle brother, "the aerospace division has maintained profitability, which is commendable. However, your team has lost 3 major contracts in the past 18 months. What steps are you taking to retain key accounts?" Unlike Thomas, Michael had always taken his role more seriously. "We've been handicapped by outdated equipment and insufficient R&D funding. Every capital expenditure request I've submitted in the past 2 years has been denied." He glanced meaningfully at his father. "That's going to change," I assured him. "Alexis will be meeting with you this afternoon to review your capital needs assessment." Finally, I turned to Robert. My husband of 7 years sat stiffly in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Robert, As VP of Business Development, can you walk us through your client acquisition strategy for the coming quarter? Robert cleared his throat. I maintain relationships with our key accounts through regular contact and social engagements. Social engagements, I repeated. And how many new accounts has this strategy yielded in the past year? He flushed slightly. Market? Conditions have been challenging. Indeed, I agreed. Yet our competitors have grown their client bases by an average of 12% during the same period. William attempted to intervene. Diane, I understand you're now a significant investor, but this approach seems unnecessarily confrontational. On the contrary, I replied. This approach is necessarily direct. Blackwell Manufacturing is losing $280,000 every month. At that burn rate, without the capital infusion from Artemis, the company would have been insolvent within the year. Every one of the 206 employees in this building would have lost their jobs. So yes, difficult questions must be asked and answered. I stood, signaling a shift in the meeting. Gentlemen, Blackwell Manufacturing has a proud history and significant potential. But potential without execution is merely wasted opportunity. Over the next 30 days, every aspect of this business will be evaluated based on performance and future value. And if we don't meet your arbitrary standards? Thomas asked, a hint of his mother's defiance in his tone. Then you'll be transitioned to roles better suited to your skills, I replied evenly, or assisted in finding opportunities elsewhere. Blackwell Manufacturing will survive and thrive, with or without the Blackwell family at its helm. The gravity of the situation finally seemed to sink in. These men had operated for years in an environment where their positions were secure regardless of performance. That era had ended. Alexis will continue with the operational review, I concluded. I have another meeting to attend. As I left the boardroom, I caught Robert's eye one last time. Behind his shock and confusion, I saw something else. Perhaps the first glimmer of genuine respect. He'd never seen this side of me before, the confident executive accustomed to command. He'd known only the version of myself I'd allowed him to see during our marriage. That discretion had been my choice. My attempt to build a relationship based on personal connection rather than financial dynamics. His affair with Veronica had made it clear how thoroughly that experiment had failed. As the boardroom door closed behind me, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The chess pieces were now arranged precisely as I needed them. The next move would be decisive. My second meeting of the morning took place not in the executive suite, but on the factory floor. Despite owning Blackwell Manufacturing for 3 months, this was my first opportunity to see the actual production facilities, the heart of the company that the Blackwell family had increasingly neglected. Marcus Rivera, the production manager, met me at the floor entrance. At 58, he'd been with Blackwell for over 30 years, rising from machine operator to his current position through dedication and innate engineering talent. His personnel file, which I'd reviewed extensively, showed a man who had repeatedly suggested innovations that were ignored by upper management. Ms. Chen, he greeted me with a firm handshake. I wasn't expecting to meet the new owner so soon. Please call me Diane, I replied. And I should have been here 3 months ago. Walk me through the operation? For the next hour, Marcus guided me through the sprawling production facility. The contrast between different sections was striking. The aerospace division featured newer equipment and a more organized workflow, while the consumer products area looked like a relic from a different era. Throughout the tour, I noted how employees reacted to Marcus, with genuine respect rather than the obligatory deference they showed to the Blackwell brothers during their rare appearances on the floor. These stamping machines, I said, pausing, by a row of aging equipment. They're from the 90s? 1987, Marcus corrected. I've been requesting replacements for 5 years. Modern units would use 40% less energy and increase output by 30%. But, he shrugged, the gesture conveying years of frustration with management. But William kept denying the capital expenditure, I finished for him, despite the clear ROI. Marcus nodded cautiously, still uncertain where I stood in the company hierarchy. Mr. Blackwell preferred to focus on short-term profitability, at the expense of long-term viability, I noted. That changes now. As we continued the tour, I asked questions about workflow, efficiency bottlenecks, and employee morale. Marcus answered with increasing openness as he realized I actually understood manufacturing processes, something the Blackwell family had never demonstrated. "You know a lot about production for an investor," he observed as we completed the circuit. "Before, I was an investor. I managed operations for a precision metals company in Pittsburgh," I explained. "My father was a plant manager for 30 years. I grew up around manufacturing floors." This wasn't information I'd shared with the Blackwells, not because it was secret, but because they'd never bothered to ask. Robert knew my father had worked in manufacturing, but had shown little interest in the details. To him, my background had been merely quaint, evidence of how far I'd come from my working-class roots. "The aerospace division has potential," I said, returning to business. "But the consumer products operation is dragging everything down." Marcus nodded, relieved that someone finally saw the obvious. "We've been saying that for years. The margins aren't there for consumer products, not with our cost structure and the competition from overseas, but Thomas is convinced he can turn it around." "Thomas is convinced because he's never had to face consequences for failure," I replied. "That's about to change." We ended our tour in Marcus's modest office overlooking the production floor. Unlike the executive suites upstairs, with their expensive furnishings and artwork, Marcus's space was functional and organized. Engineering diagrams and production schedules covered the walls, and a whiteboard displayed current efficiency metrics for each production line. "I'd like you to prepare a prioritized list of capital improvements," I told him, taking a seat across from his desk. "Focus on changes that would yield immediate efficiency gains or address critical maintenance issues. Budget cap is $5 million for the initial phase." Marcus stared at me in disbelief. $5 million? That's more than our entire capital budget for the past 3 years combined. "I know," I replied. "The previous management philosophy was fundamentally flawed. We're correcting that error." As Marcus began outlining his most urgent recommendations, my phone buzzed with a text from Alexis. "Eleanor attempting to rally board members, claiming you have personal vendetta. 3 aren't biting." I smiled slightly. Eleanor was predictable, if nothing else. I'd anticipated this move and taken precautions. "One more thing," I said to Marcus as our meeting concluded. "I'd like you to join the executive leadership team, effective immediately. We'll be announcing a reorganization next week, and I want you to head operations across all divisions." Marcus blinked in surprise. "That would put me above Michael and Thomas in the org chart." "Yes," I confirmed. "It would. Is that a problem?" "That a problem? Not for me," he replied carefully. "But the family." "The family will adapt or depart," I said simply. "This company's future will be determined by competence, not bloodlines." After finishing with Marcus, I made my way toward the employee cafeteria. My next meeting wasn't scheduled on any official calendar, but it was perhaps the most important of the day. The Blackwell Manufacturing Cafeteria was like most industrial dining facilities, functional, institutional, and separated by invisible, but rigid hierarchies. Machine operators occupied the tables near the food service area, office staff claimed the center section, and management, when they deigned to eat with the rank and file, took the tables near the windows. I bypassed the serving line and headed directly for a table in the corner where a woman in her mid-30s sat alone, picking at a salad while reviewing documents on her tablet. Most employees didn't recognize me, but several noticed my designer suit and executive bearing, tracking my movement across the room with curious glances. "Veronica Fisher?" I asked, stopping at her table. She looked up, confusion crossing her features as she tried to place me. The moment of recognition was immediate and dramatic, her face draining of color as she realized exactly who had approached. Her? Mrs. Blackwell, she stammered, half rising from her seat. I didn't. Ms. Chen, actually, I corrected calmly. I kept my maiden name. May I join you? Without waiting for a response, I took the seat across from her. The cafeteria had grown noticeably quieter. Employees at nearby tables suddenly finding their lunches fascinating while straining to overhear our conversation. I think we're overdue for a conversation, don't you? I said, keeping my voice low, but not whispering. There was nothing furtive about this encounter. I wanted it witnessed. Veronica swallowed hard. As Robert's executive assistant for the past 2 years, she had scheduled his meetings, managed his correspondence, and, for at least 12 months, according to my PI's report, been engaged in an affair with him. Ms. Chen, she began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. Let me help you, I offered. You've been having an affair with my husband. I'm now your boss's boss's boss. This is, to put it mildly, an awkward situation for all involved. Her eyes darted around the cafeteria, now acutely aware of the attention we were attracting. I never meant to, she tried again. Intentions are irrelevant at this point, I interrupted. We're dealing with facts and consequences now. I placed a folder on the table between us. Inside is a severance package, 6 months' salary, continuation of benefits, and a reference that mentions nothing about the circumstances of your departure. The only condition is that you clear out your desk today and have no further contact with Robert. Veronica stared at the folder, then back at me. You're firing me? I'm offering you a dignified exit, I corrected. The alternative is less appealing. This is punishment, she said, a hint of defiance entering her voice. For the affair? No, I replied calmly. This is a business decision. Your position requires discretion and good judgment, qualities your personal choices have called into question. Additionally, the executive assistant to the VP of Business Development is a role that may not exist in our new organizational structure. I stood, having made my point. You have until 5 p.m. to decide. My email is on the first page of the folder. As I turned to leave, Veronica found her voice again. He said you were distant, cold, that you didn't understand him. I paused, then looked back at her. And yet, I understood him well enough to buy his family's company while he was busy betraying me. Something to consider. My final meeting of the day took place in my newly established office on the executive floor, formerly a conference room that had been hastily converted by my team the previous evening. The space was deliberately Spartan: a functional desk, ergonomic chair, and simple visitor seating. The only personal touch was a small photograph of my parents on their 30th anniversary, a reminder of what real commitment looked like. A knock at the precisely scheduled time announced Robert's arrival. He entered without waiting for a response, a habit that suddenly struck me as presumptuous rather than familiar. You wanted to see me? He asked, his tone attempting professional distance despite the personal chaos between us. Have a seat, I replied, gesturing to the chair across from me. We need to discuss several matters. Robert sat stiffly, his eyes taking in the transformed space that had once been the room where his grandfather had displayed hunting trophies. You've been busy. Necessarily so, I agreed. The company's situation is more precarious than you realize, or perhaps than you were allowed to realize. What does that mean? It means your father has been shielding you and your brothers from the financial reality for years, I explained. Blackwell Manufacturing has been operating at a loss since 2019. The only thing keeping it afloat was a series of high-interest loans and the gradual liquidation of non-essential assets. Robert frowned. That's not possible. We've received profit distributions every quarter. Those weren't profit distributions, I corrected. They were withdrawals of capital. Your family has been cannibalizing the company to maintain your lifestyles. The truth seemed to hit him physically, his posture slumping as the implications sank in. Dad never said. William made choices, I said, neither condemning nor excusing his father's actions. Now we all live with the consequences of those choices. I opened a folder on my desk, the third such folder of the day, but this one containing documents of a more personal nature. Which brings us to our situation, I continued. I've had divorce papers prepared. The terms are simple. We each retain our separate assets, divide the common property equitably, and go our separate ways. No alimony, no extended proceedings. Robert stared at the papers I pushed across the desk. Just like that? 7 years of marriage ended with a business transaction? Would you prefer a messy public divorce? I asked. One where your affair with Veronica becomes a matter of court record? Where financial discovery reveals how your family has been managing the company? Where Eleanor's interference in our marriage becomes public knowledge? He had no answer for that. Robert had always avoided conflict, preferring the path of least resistance. It was one of the qualities that had made him susceptible to his mother's manipulation, and ultimately to the temptation of an affair that offered validation without challenge. You never told me, he said finally, about your investments, your business, all these years, and I never really knew you. You never asked, I replied simply. You were content with the version of me that fit your preconceptions? When was the last time you inquired about my work beyond asking if I'd had a good day? Robert's silence was answer enough. Our marriage had been built on a foundation of assumptions and appearances, a structure too fragile to withstand real pressure. I'll need time to review these with my lawyer, he said, taking the divorce papers. Of course, I agreed. But I should note that your continued employment at Blackwell Manufacturing is not contingent on our personal situation. Those are separate evaluations. He looked up sharply. You'd fire me too? If your performance doesn't justify your position. Yes, I confirmed. But I'd also retain you if you demonstrate actual value. Like I said, separate evaluations. As Robert rose to leave, he paused at the door. Did you buy the company because you suspected the affair? It was a question I'd anticipated, though not so directly stated. No, I answered truthfully. I bought the company because it was a sound investment with proper management. The timing was coincidental. He nodded slowly, accepting the answer, even if he didn't fully believe it. Eleanor won't stop, you know. She'll fight this every way she can. I'm counting on it, I replied with a slight smile. In fact, I've prepared for it. As the door closed behind him, I turned to my computer and opened the document I'd been working on between meetings. A comprehensive restructuring plan for Blackwell Manufacturing. Phase 1 was already underway. Phase 2 would begin tomorrow. Eleanor's inevitable counterattack would arrive precisely when I needed it most, providing the perfect justification for the most dramatic changes yet to come. Eleanor's counterattack came sooner than even I had anticipated. By 7 a.m. the following morning, my phone was buzzing with alerts from the security team at Blackwell Manufacturing. Overnight, the locks to the executive offices had been forcibly changed, an amateur attempt to block my access to the building. More significantly, someone had attempted to access the company's financial servers from an unauthorized terminal, triggering the security protocols my IT team had implemented during the transition. Any doubt who's behind this? Alexis asked, as we stood in the parking lot watching the locksmith restore proper access to the building. None whatsoever, I replied. Eleanor always was direct, if not particularly subtle. The server access attempt is more concerning, Alexis noted, scrolling through the security report on her tablet. They were trying to transfer $2.4 million to an offshore account. I nodded, unsurprised. William's emergency fund. He's been moving small amounts to a Cayman Islands account for years. Eleanor must have convinced him to accelerate the process. The locksmith finished his work, and we entered the building to find Eleanor herself seated regally in the reception area, as if awaiting honored guests rather than having orchestrated corporate sabotage. Her cream-colored St. John suit and perfectly coiffed hair presented the image of dignified propriety, an image at odds with her actual behavior. Breaking and entering is a serious crime, I observed as we approached, as is attempted financial fraud. Eleanor's smile didn't falter. This is still a Blackwell family company regardless of your paperwork. William founded this business and his father before him. You're just a temporary inconvenience. An inconvenience with controlling interest and a team of corporate attorneys, I countered. But we can discuss your criminal trespass later. I believe the police are already on their way. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Eleanor's composed features. The police? Don't be dramatic, Diane. This is a family matter. No, I corrected firmly. This is a business matter involving unauthorized access to secured premises and attempted theft of company assets. But if you'd prefer to discuss it at the police station rather than here, that can be arranged. Before she could respond, William emerged from the elevator, his face ashen. Seeing his wife confronted in the lobby had clearly not been part of whatever plan they had concocted. Diane, he began, his voice conciliatory. There's been a misunderstanding. Has there? I asked coolly. Perhaps you can explain the misunderstanding. Behind attempting to transfer $2.4 million of company funds to your personal offshore account at 3:17 this morning? William paled further, glancing nervously at Eleanor. I was merely securing operational funds during this transition period. Operational funds, I repeated, to an account in the Cayman Islands that only you can access. An account not listed on any of the company's financial disclosures to investors or the board. Eleanor rose, attempting to regain control of the situation. William is the chairman of this company. He has every right. William is the former chairman, I interrupted. As of 9 a.m. yesterday, when the board voted to restructure the executive leadership, a meeting you would have known about, Eleanor, had you maintained a professional relationship with the company, rather than treating it as your personal fiefdom. This was clearly news to her. She turned to William, accusation in her eyes. What is she talking about? What vote? William couldn't meet her gaze. It was a formality. A temporary measure during the capital restructuring. It was a binding board resolution, I corrected. One that removed William as chairman and installed our new executive leadership team. I turned back to Eleanor. Which means neither of you had any authority to access this building after hours or attempt financial transactions. The police arrived just as I finished speaking. 2 officers escorted by our head of security. I had no intention of having my in-laws arrested, despite their actions deserving it. The police presence was merely to establish the severity of the situation and ensure it was documented officially. Ms. Chen, the security director said, approaching with a tablet. We've completed the initial assessment. In addition to the attempted financial transfer, several company files were copied to an external device from Mr. Blackwell's terminal. I nodded, having expected as much. Please provide the officers with your report. We'll need this documented for the restraining order. Restraining order? Eleanor echoed, genuine shock breaking through her composed facade. A temporary measure, I explained, echoing William's earlier words. To prevent further unauthorized access to company property during this transition period. I turned to the officers. We won't be pressing charges at this time, but we do need the incident formally documented. As the police took statements from our security team, I gestured for William and Eleanor to follow me to a nearby conference room, away from the growing audience of arriving employees. Once inside, I closed the door and faced them directly. Me be absolutely clear, I said, my voice low but firm. What happened last night crossed the line from family drama to corporate crime. I have grounds not only for criminal charges but for civil action that would leave you both financially ruined. Eleanor started to speak, but I held up a hand, silencing her. I'm not pressing charges. Not because I owe you any consideration, but because a public scandal would harm the company and its employees. However, this is your only warning. If either of you attempts to interfere with Blackwell Manufacturing again, I will use every legal resource at my disposal to hold you accountable. William seemed to age years in minutes, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. Eleanor, however, was not so easily subdued. You think you've won, she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. That you can just take our family, legacy, and discard decades of tradition. Robert may be temporarily confused by whatever manipulation you're employing, but blood is thicker than water. When this is over, you'll have nothing. I studied her for a moment, struck by the irony of her position. Eleanor genuinely believed herself to be the wronged party, the defender of family legacy against an outsider's intrusion. Her worldview was so narrow, so centered on her own perceived entitlement, that she couldn't see how her actions had contributed to the company's decline. Eleanor, I said finally, the company was failing long before I acquired it. Your family's legacy was 3 months from bankruptcy. Had I not stepped in, every employee in this building would be unemployed by summer, and the Blackwell name would be associated with corporate failure rather than manufacturing excellence. That's a lie, she hissed. William has managed this company successfully for 30 years. William hasn't managed this company successfully for at least a decade, I corrected. The financial records make that abundantly clear. What they also make clear is how your family has been extracting personal wealth at the expense of the company's health. I slid a folder across the table. I'd prepared it the previous evening, anticipating this confrontation. This is a summary of personal expenses charged to the company over the past 5 years. Your shopping trips to Paris, Thomas's failed restaurant venture, Michael's vacation home renovation, Robert's extensive entertainment budget, primarily spent at exclusive clubs where Veronica accompanied him, all categorized as business expenses, while the company was losing money and laying off skilled workers. Eleanor didn't touch the folder, but William reached for it with trembling hands. As he scanned the contents, his expression shifted from defiance to something approaching shame. Eleanor, he said quietly, she's right. The numbers, they're worse than I admitted to you. This is absurd, Eleanor insisted, though with less conviction. A few personal expenses are standard practice for company executives. A few personal expenses, yes, I agreed. Millions in undocumented withdrawals over several years? That's not standard practice. That's systematic corporate looting. I stood, gathering my materials. The restraining order will be in place by noon. Neither of you is to enter Blackwell Manufacturing property without express written permission from the new executive team. Any company assets currently in your possession must be returned within 48 hours, or they'll be reported stolen. As I reached the door, Eleanor made one final attempt. The employees won't accept this. They're loyal to the Blackwell family. I turned back, allowing myself a small smile. Are they? Let's find out. Without another word, I left the conference room and made my way to the factory floor, where the morning shift was already in full swing. Marcus Rivera met me at the entrance, concern evident on his face. Word spreading about the police, he said quietly. People are nervous. Then let's address it directly, I replied. While Eleanor believed the workforce was loyal to the Blackwell name, I had spent the past 3 months reviewing personnel files, compensation structures, and the company's declining benefits program. What I had discovered was not family loyalty, but worker desperation. Employees staying despite deteriorating conditions because jobs were scarce, and the local economy depended on Blackwell Manufacturing. I followed Marcus to the center of the production floor, where he activated the PA system. Work gradually came to a halt as operators turned their attention to the unusual morning announcement. "Good morning," I began, my voice carrying across the suddenly quiet factory. "For those who don't know me, I'm Diane Chen, representing Artemis Holdings, the new majority owner of Blackwell Manufacturing. Many of you have noticed unusual activity this morning, including police presence in the building. I want to address this directly." Over the next 5 minutes, I explained the ownership transition, the attempted financial improprieties, and, most importantly, our plans for the company's future. I outlined the $5 million initial investment in new equipment, the restoration of the pension program that had been temporarily suspended 3 years ago, and the profit-sharing plan that would be implemented once the company returned to profitability. Blackwell Manufacturing has a proud history and a skilled workforce, I concluded. With proper investment and management, I believe this company can not only survive, but thrive. All I ask is the opportunity to prove that with actions rather than words. As I finished speaking, the factory remained silent for a long moment. Then, from the back of the aerospace division, a slow hand clap began. It spread gradually, building into applause that reflected not blind enthusiasm, but cautious hope, perhaps the first real hope these workers had experienced in years. Eleanor had been wrong about their loyalty. The employees weren't loyal to a family name. They were loyal to their livelihoods, their colleagues, and the pride they took in their work. Elements the Blackwell family had taken for granted for far too long. As I made my way back to the executive floor, I knew that the most difficult phase of the transition was now beginning. Eleanor's attempted sabotage had provided the catalyst I needed to accelerate the restructuring plan. What had been scheduled as a gradual 3-month transition would now be compressed into weeks. By the time I reached my office, my decision was made. The moment Eleanor had crossed the line from family drama to corporate crime, she had fundamentally changed the equation. This was no longer just about saving a company or navigating a failing marriage. It was about protecting what I had built from those who would destroy it out of pride and entitlement. The chess game had entered its decisive phase. It was time to capture the queen. The restraining order was in place by noon, as promised. Eleanor and William were legally barred from entering Blackwell Manufacturing property without written authorization, and company assets in their possession, including the luxury SUV William had been driving at company expense, were to be returned within 48 hours. My next move required careful timing. While Eleanor and William were still reeling from the morning's confrontation, I needed to meet with the remaining family members individually. Michael was first on my list, the middle brother and, from all evidence, the most competent of the 3 siblings. "You wanted to see me?" Michael asked, entering my office precisely at the scheduled time. Unlike his brothers, Michael had always maintained a degree of professional discipline, a quality I had noted in my evaluations. "Yes, please sit down," I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "I want to discuss your future with the company." Michael tensed visibly. "Is this where you fire me too?" "Actually," I replied, "this is where I offer you a promotion." His expression shifted from defensive to confused. "A promotion? After everything that's happened?" "What's happened is that your parents attempted to commit financial fraud," I said, calmly. "You weren't involved in that decision, were you?" "No," he replied quickly, then hesitated. "Though Mother did call last night, hinting that I should secure important files before coming in today. I told her I wouldn't do that." I nodded, having already confirmed his non-involvement through our security logs. "That decision speaks to your character, which is partly why we're having this conversation." I opened a folder on my desk, different from the one I'd shown his parents earlier. The aerospace division has been the only consistently profitable segment of Blackwell Manufacturing for the past 5 years. Your management of that division, despite being denied proper capital investment, demonstrates both technical knowledge and leadership ability. Michael sat straighter, clearly surprised by this assessment. Thank you, but the team deserves most of the credit. A good leader always credits their team, I observed. But data doesn't lie. Your division maintains the highest efficiency metrics and lowest turnover rate in the company. I slid a document across the desk. This is our proposed reorganization plan. As you can see, we're consolidating the 3 current divisions into 2: aerospace, defense, and precision components. The consumer products division will be phased out entirely. Michael studied the organizational chart, his eyes widening slightly as he found his name. You want me to lead the aerospace defense division as executive vice president? Yes, I confirmed. Reporting directly to Marcus Rivera, who will become Chief Operations Officer. The role comes with significant autonomy and a compensation package tied to divisional performance. Michael looked up from the document, studying my face for signs of deception or manipulation. Why me? After what my mother did to you, what Robert did, why trust any Blackwell? It was a fair question, one that demonstrated more self-awareness than I'd observed in any other family member. I don't make business decisions based on personal grievances, I replied. Your performance data supports this promotion. The fact that you've maintained professional ethics despite family pressure further confirms it's the right choice. I leaned forward slightly. However, I should be clear. This isn't charity or family courtesy. You'll be held to rigorous performance standards, and your compensation will be directly tied to results. No more guaranteed bonuses or discretionary expense. Accounts. Michael nodded slowly, still processing the unexpected offer. What about Thomas and Robert? Thomas will be offered a severance package, I said frankly. The consumer products division has been losing money for years, and his performance reviews suggest limited transferable skills for our new structure. And my brother? Your husband? Michael asked cautiously. I kept my expression neutral, though the question touched on the most complex aspect of this entire situation. Robert's position is being evaluated. Business development will exist in the new organization, but with a more focused mandate and accountability metrics. Michael set the document down, his decision apparently made. I appreciate the offer and I accept. But you should know, Eleanor won't stop. This will only escalate her campaign against you. I'm counting on it, I replied with a small smile. In fact, it's a key component of my strategy. After Michael left, I had similar conversations with Thomas and 2 other executives whose positions were being eliminated. Thomas, predictably, did not take the news well, threatening legal action despite the severance package being far more generous than his performance warranted. By mid-afternoon, the restructuring was proceeding exactly as planned. Robert was my final meeting of the day, scheduled deliberately for 5 p.m., when most employees would be leaving. Our personal situation complicated the professional discussion, and I wanted to minimize potential gossip. Unlike our meeting the previous day, when Robert had entered with unearned confidence, today he knocked tentatively before entering my office. The divorce papers I'd given him were in his hand, along with what appeared to be additional documents. You've made your decision, I observed, noting the papers. Yes, he replied, placing them on my desk. I've signed the divorce agreement. My lawyer reviewed it this morning and agreed the terms are fair. I glanced at the signature page, confirming his acceptance of the straightforward dissolution of our marriage. Thank you for not dragging this out unnecessarily. What choice did I have? He asked, a hint of bitterness in his tone. You hold all the cards now. This isn't about leverage, Robert, I replied. It's about acknowledging reality. Our marriage has been over for months, since you began your affair with Veronica, if not before. I'm simply formalizing what already exists. He nodded slowly, accepting this truth even if he didn't like it. Mother called me 6 times today. He paused, searching for the appropriate word. Furious, I suggested. Planning revenge? Threatening legal action? All of the above, he confirmed with a grim smile. She wants me to contest the divorce, claim you manipulated the company acquisition, and argue that your vindictive actions should invalidate the sale. And what did you tell her? Robert sighed, looking suddenly tired. That I'm done being her puppet, that I made my own mess, and I'll handle the consequences like an adult. It was perhaps the most honest thing Robert had said to me in years. For a moment, I glimpsed the man I'd thought I was marrying, someone with potential for growth and self-reflection, qualities that had been systematically stifled by his family's dynamics. That's commendable, I acknowledged. And professionally speaking? Robert straightened slightly, shifting to business matters. I want to resign as VP of Business Development, effective immediately. This surprised me. I had expected him to fight for his position, or at least negotiate a generous severance. May I ask why? I inquired, genuinely curious. Because I'm not qualified for the role, he replied simply. I never was. I got the position because of my name, not my abilities. And if I stayed, every achievement or failure would be viewed through the lens of our personal history. I studied him for a moment, reassessing my soon-to-be ex-husband. Perhaps there was more substance to Robert than I had recently given him credit for. What will you do? I asked. I have some savings, he said, enough to take some time, figure out what I actually want to do, rather than what was expected of me. He hesitated, then added, and I've ended things with Veronica, not because of the divorce or the company situation, but because it was wrong. I should have either worked on our marriage or ended it honestly. I nodded, appreciating his candor even if it came too late to save our relationship. I accept your resignation. HR will prepare the standard paperwork. As Robert turned to leave, he paused at the door. For what it's worth, I am sorry. Not just for the affair, but for never truly seeing you. You deserved better. After he left, I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the unexpected turn our conversation had taken. Robert's apology didn't change anything about our situation, but it did suggest that perhaps Eleanor's influence wasn't as absolute as I had assumed. If Robert could break free of her manipulation, others might follow. My phone buzzed with a text from Alexis. Attempting to contact board members. 3 have reported her calls. Legal is monitoring. Eleanor's counteroffensive was proceeding exactly as anticipated. As the majority shareholder, I had the votes to implement any changes I wanted, but I preferred to maintain board support rather than override them. Eleanor's aggressive tactics were actually helping my cause, alienating the very allies she was trying to recruit. I sent a quick reply. Proceed with Phase 3 tomorrow. Accelerate the timeline. Phase 3 was the most dramatic aspect of our restructuring plan, the one I had originally intended to implement gradually over several months. Eleanor's actions had provided the perfect justification to compress that timeline into days. Tomorrow, we would announce the complete rebranding of Blackwell Manufacturing. The company that had borne the Blackwell name for 3 generations would become Artemis Precision Technologies, with a new visual identity, mission statement, and corporate structure. The Blackwell legacy wouldn't be erased, the company history would acknowledge its origins, but the future would belong to a new entity, one untainted by recent controversies. As I gathered my things to leave the office, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Diane Chen. You think you're clever? Eleanor's voice was cold with fury. Turning my own sons against me, stealing our company. Eleanor, I replied calmly, I strongly suggest you speak with your attorney before continuing this conversation. I don't need an attorney to tell me you've manipulated this situation from the beginning. she continued, ignoring my warning. First, you trapped Robert in marriage, and now you're using our family difficulties to seize control of our legacy. Remained silent, letting her incriminate herself further. My phone was set to record all calls, a security measure implemented after the first threatening message Eleanor had left weeks ago. You won't get away with this, she hissed. I built this company alongside William. I've sacrificed everything for the Blackwell name. You're nothing but an opportunistic outsider who now owns controlling interest in what used to be your family business, I interrupted, my patience exhausted. Eleanor, this call is being recorded. Every threat you make, every accusation you level, is evidence I can use in court. I suggest you consider that carefully before you continue. The line went silent for a moment. Then, this isn't over. Actually, it is, I replied. As of tomorrow, there won't even be a Blackwell manufacturing for you to fight over. Goodbye, Eleanor. I ended the call and forwarded the recording to our legal team. Eleanor had just handed me the final piece I needed to justify the accelerated rebranding, documented harassment from the former matriarch, creating a hostile environment that necessitated immediate and decisive action. All the pieces were now in position. Tomorrow would bring the pivotal confrontation that would determine not just the company's future, but the final resolution of my entanglement with the Blackwell family. I announced the company's complete rebranding to Artemis Precision Technologies at the all-hands meeting. Eleanor and William watched from the back row, their power finally broken. This company will honor its history while embracing a future built on integrity and shared success, I declared. The enthusiastic applause from employees confirmed what I already knew. They wanted leadership, not legacy. As Eleanor stormed out, Michael approached me. You know, when Mother exposed Robert's affair at dinner, she thought she was destroying you. Instead, she freed you to be who you truly are. Smiled. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't getting even, it's moving forward.